Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey friends, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Rural Women Podcast this year, and we are taking a look back through the inspiring stories that have been shared with us throughout the years. Looking back through these interviews, there are women who have been successful, who have persevered, and who have been resilient. There are women who have shared their stories who may not farm or ranch or homestead or work in the business that they used to. Things may be different for them now, but I know their stories have impact. And I hope that this is a solid reminder for those of you who have shared your stories or who are inspired to share your stories. Our stories are forever changing. And just because we may not farm, ranch, or homestead the same, our lives might not look the same. There has been growth here. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it's a solid reminder for all of us to look back to see how far we've come. So my friends, I hope you enjoy these throwback podcast episodes coming your way, and thank you for being here and for helping me celebrate the incredible stories of women in agriculture through the Rural Woman Podcast over the last 5 years. Enjoy. This week, you'll meet Rhonda Kesslering.
So my name is Rhonda. I'm from a small town in southern Saskatchewan. I grew up on a grain farm. My parents were grain farmers, but they also were entrepreneurs. They had different businesses. My dad was a pilot, and he also repaired aircrafts. My mom loves gardening, loves cooking, and she also had kind of a business of her own where she would make mustard and artisan flavored vinegars and herb mixes, and we used to go all over the countryside to trade shows and stuff like that. So I've always been involved on the farm, in the garden, and yeah, that's kind of where I grew up. And then I went to school to be a vet tech, and I worked as a tech for about 4 years. I worked in a mixed animal practice. And then I was experiencing burnout, just really fatigued and overwhelmed. Vet tech is a very emotionally draining career, and it kind of just worked out great because my brother was needing some extra help on the farm. He had taken over and needing some extra help, and I was needing a job, so I ended up working on the farm with him.
You had mentioned the key word here is burnout. And like we were chatting about before we hit record, that is something that I hear quite often from other people in animal veterinary services, whether they are the veterinarian or vet tech or any like that. So take us on the journey and tell us about your career as a vet tech and from the beginning to end.
Soup to nuts. Okay.
Yeah. How Saskatchewan of you to say that.
So I have always loved animals. Growing up, I begged and pleaded my family for dogs, chickens, whatever I could, and nothing. They didn't want anything. So I had cats. I had cats, and then when I was about 10, we got a dog. So I've always loved animals, and I had considered going to university for vet med. And I decided to try the tech program first because actually some of the credits can transfer over towards an undergrad degree and then towards a vet med. I started out with vet tech and I worked as a tech for about 4 years. I worked in 2 different clinics. They were both mixed animal practice. So one of them was more large animal and one was more on the small animal side, and I learned a ton, but at the same time, veterinary medicine is one of those careers that has like a really high burnout rate. It has a lot of people that suffer from health issues, and I was definitely experiencing that towards the end of my career as a tech. I loved the work. I loved getting animals in, getting my hands on them, learning about behavior. I loved doing surgery, monitoring them during anesthetic. I loved all of that. I loved the sciencey, nerdy, like lab work type things. I loved being out on farm, doing semen testing and stuff like that. So it was never really the work. It was more honestly, you're so underpaid as a tech and the hours that you're expected to work and all of the things that you see are just so traumatic. Like when an animal comes in that's been hit by a car, it takes an emotional toll on a person. And eventually I was feeling really depressed, anxious. I was experiencing panic attacks, which I had never had before in my life. And I just decided that it was no longer for me. So I transitioned to working back on the farm.
Today, you'll meet Deborah Niemann. Tell us a bit more about yourself and how you got your start in agriculture.
Well, it's kind of funny because I actually grew up in a small town and couldn't wait to go to the big city of Houston on the weekends and hated small towns, heard my mother say nothing but negative stuff about farm life because my grandparents had a farm and both of my parents had grown up on a farm and lived on a farm till I was 3. So I was definitely not a person that you would have ever thought that you would find on a farm. But for whatever reason, I kind of think maybe it was those visits to my grandparents' farm as a small child that just really drew me in. I just thought it was so cool. Like I helped my grandmother make butter one time. And that just gave me the idea that like nothing just magically appears on the grocery store shelves. Like it all comes from somewhere, you know? And so even when I lived in cities and stuff, I started making my own strawberry jam and I started making peanut butter when I saw somebody selling peanuts on the side of the road one day when my husband was in the Navy. We lived in Florida. So I started doing that. And then at some point, my husband and I said, why don't we move to the country and start growing our own food?
You go from the side of the road peanuts to leaving city and going straight to the country. I love that. So take us back to the decision that you and your husband made to move from the city to the country. What was that like making that? And how did that journey happen for you?
Well, we started talking about it about 9 years before we actually did it. And we just kept saying, we should move to the country so we can grow our own food organically. But whenever like my husband would get a job transfer or something and we'd move, we would look for a place in the country, but we could never find what we wanted. It was always like, 2 acres cut out of a cornfield, with maybe 2 or 3 trees in the yard. And it just, or the house was too small if the land was right. It was not working. And then I went to the Garfield Farm Rare Breed Show. I was a reporter in the Chicago suburbs, and I went to this rare breed livestock show at a farm museum. And I saw all these chickens that I remembered seeing on my grandparents' farm. And the people who had them said that they were in danger of extinction because they didn't fit into the commercial model. And so they were really only being raised by small farmers and backyard hobbyists at this point, because the commercial chicken industry basically had 2 hybrid breeds of chickens. They've got one breed of chicken over here that they have perfected to be like the absolute best egg layer. And then on the other end, they've got this other chicken breed hybrid that they have perfected to gain weight faster than any other breed out there. Whereas like the chickens on my grandparents' farm, they were decent egg layers and they gave you a good chicken dinner too. But they weren't going to reach that chicken dinner size by 6 to 8 weeks. They were going to reach it by like 4.5 months. And they weren't going to lay 300 eggs a year. They were going to lay maybe 180 to 220 eggs a year. And so I was just shocked that like, oh my gosh, like my children might not be able to see chickens like this, And so it's funny. Like I went home that day and it was like, all of a sudden I had a mission. It's like, okay, we have to move to the country now so we can start raising rare breeds of animals because they're going to go extinct. Because I always thought that like, oh, like this, white tiger is in danger of extinction or some wildlife, and there's nothing I can do about that. Like, that's really sad. But all of a sudden, like, not only was it within my reach to make a difference, but it fit in perfectly with what we had been talking about already. And so that's when we started to get serious and we started looking more. And then within a couple of years, we found a place and we did it.
This week, we're catching up with my dear friend, Annabel Morgan. Catch us up. What has been happening? We have lived through so many things in the last 2 years. So catch us up on what has been happening in life and on the ranch.
So the ranch is good. It's been, obviously we had COVID and a cattle market crash and pretty extreme drought. So that was tough and continues to be tough. But we are holding on. We had to sell about 100 head of cattle because of lack of feed for the winter because our hay crop was down so much this year. And so that's pretty tough, especially after a big crash the year before. But we're so lucky, we inherited this ranch. So it's not like we have to make a monthly payment to keep it going. So we understand how lucky we are. And there's so many people who aren't in the same position as us. So it is just part of ranching, and we're here. But on top of that, right in the middle of COVID, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. So that has been very difficult.
Yes. And that is something that you are graciously willing to share with me and the audience. And I just want to take a minute before we dive into more questions and say thank you, because I think what you've been through has been extremely difficult on top of what the world has been going through, which is extremely difficult. So thank you for being open to sharing this story with us. And thank you to Zaid, your husband, for, being happy or being okay with everybody hearing his story too. I would interview him, but I'm sure he understands that we don't do that here. So
yeah, no boys allowed.
No boys allowed. So take us back to, I guess, 2020 and kind of the journey up to Zaid being diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah. So we were in the fall of 2019, right? Yeah. And my husband has horrible allergies and goes into anaphylactic shock several times a year. We still don't actually know exactly why. We think it's pollen on food, and then he goes into anaphylactic shock. But he complained that his ear was hurting all fall. But as we know, COVID was ramping up, and he avoided the emergency room because we didn't want to get COVID. This was pre getting a jab and all those things. So we waited months. And finally, as if because you're my friend, and I didn't talk about it with a lot of people, but I knew something was wrong and had shared that with you. We knew something was wrong. Anyway, he finally went in January. We were snuck in because of a favor from a family member that's a doctor to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And he did an endoscopy and said, "I'm afraid that you have cancer." Right away, he knew what it looked like. My husband previously smoked and chewed, as cowboys do, and cowgirls, unfortunately. And he does not any longer, but he was diagnosed with non-HPV squamous cell carcinoma, which is HPV, as we know, is a virus, and it's very common to get oral and esophageal cancers from, but he does not have HPV. This was most likely from smoking. So, and genetics play a big, big role. So there we were.
I can remember speaking to you around the holidays in 2020, going into 2021, and just knowing how scared you both were.
My name is Karri Munn-Venn, and I am the co-owner and head shepherd at Ferme Les Saunes Farms in the Pontiac region of West Quebec. And it makes our kids crazy when we say this, but the start in agriculture really came when this place found us. February of 2020, it was a quiet, like one of those perfect lazy Saturday afternoons when we didn't have to be anywhere. Everybody was just sort of doing their thing. And kind of out of the blue, my husband went on MLS and did a search he'd never done before. He's a unilingual Anglophone. He hadn't thought living in Quebec was going to be his thing. He found this place. It was the first one that popped up. Within an hour, we were here. We knocked on the front door and said, we'd like to buy some eggs and maybe your farm. And we moved in about 4 months later. Best decision we've ever made.
That timeline blows my mind. Pre-2020 then, what was your connection to agriculture? Did you have one? What are some of your first memories of food and farming?
Well, when I grew up, my father still lives about 20 minutes from where he was born and had friends that he's known his entire life. And two of them, brothers, had a farm that we spent a lot of time on when I was a kid. But it was a dairy operation, so they had Holstein cattle. And when I was really little, I remember going out and, helping to milk the cows or feed calves. I remember bottle feeding calves and stuff. And then almost as soon as I was old enough to realize those were actually chores, that those were the things that my friends and their cousins tried to avoid doing, I was like, well, wait a minute. Why am I doing somebody else's? Anyway, and then I didn't participate in it that much. Growing up, though, I was always, knowing where my food came from, I always had, I don't know if suspicion's the best word, but, I studied international politics and had a lot of concerns about some of the big food companies and sort of where our food came from, how farmers were treated in the global south and that kind of thing. And then as an adult, we often participated in CSAs, so getting our food from farms, actually a number of which are in the region that we live in now. When we were in the city, there was a local dairy for a while that you could get glass bottles of milk delivered. And so that was interesting to me, but I don't know that I ever aspired to farming. And actually, sometimes I joke that I think I became a farmer because I'm a knitter and I wanted to grow my own yarn.
This week, you'll meet Naima Dorr. Tell the listeners who you are and how you got your start in agriculture.
So farming is something that I just fell in love with, and it just organically just found me and my family. Initially, I was just really interested in growing food for my first child and my family, and quickly realized growing microgreens and herbs inside our tiny apartment was just not a sustainable way of growing food. So we transitioned to a community garden, and later on, a few years after, we enrolled in an incubator farm in 2016. And that was the journey. That was the start of our farming. And like I said, we just wanted to grow our food as much as we can in a clean space. And I think our second year when I realized, I was like, oh, okay, I can do this. I can continue growing food, not just for my family, but for the community and make it into something.
Something that I've read about you was a project that you started, and that was the Somali American Farmers Association. Tell me more about that and what drove you to start such a project.
Yeah, so the Somali American Farmers Association is a nonprofit that I established in 2016. Going back to 2016 when the community learned about, me actually farming and my family farming outside of the Twin Cities in a rural area. I think there was a lot of excitement and a lot of curiosity, and just the word got out, right? And so I always wanted to give back and also provide service in terms of training services or just the introduction to agriculture in this great state of Minnesota to the community. So in 2020 is when I formed SAFA, the Somali American Farmers Association. And there's many goals for me to not only introduce agriculture to the community, the African community, but to make sure that the community has access to fresh produce that is available and affordable. But there is a targeted project that we just wrapped up our first season in South Minneapolis. It's called the Horn Towers, which is a public housing, and it's really elderly complex where a lot of them don't have access to fresh produce. So I created an urban farm, and it's so beautiful because the elders will come down from their unit, come to the farm and participate in the program, whether, they're helping out with planting, weeding, harvesting, and then they go back to their unit with fresh produce and all available to them free. But that interaction and that time that they spend with me and others in the farm it's been a great experience so far, and we're continuing to provide fresh produce to that particular community there. But also the goal is to really expand in other areas that is populated with East African communities, which lacks green space and fresh produce. So that the nonprofit, it really does work around food insecurity and just really utilizing park spaces or spaces that the community come together and grow food.
We are kicking off 2022 with Jan and Erin Johnson. Introduce who you are and give a bit of your background.
Sure. Okay.
You go first.
I'll go first. Okay. My name is Erin. So we're a mother and daughter team, and we're co-founders of Trailblazer Co. And under that is Trailblazer Magazine. So a printed magazine dedicated to showcasing the lives, wisdom, and businesses of enterprising rural women across North America. We've got a thriving membership for rural women and their businesses. I'm a mom. I live with my partner, Jean, and our almost 4-year-old Luca. We all live together.
Yeah.
We've got 80 chickens, too many ducks and dogs and cats, but we live a happy life on the prairies of Alberta.
Yeah. And so we haven't always done this. Our previous business was called Prairie Girl Outpost. And through that, we would help women. We would build websites. We'd create marketing collateral, teach workshops, develop course materials. And so we've been working together it's over 20 years now, which is kind of shocking. I don't feel like I've aged, but my body does.
If I've aged, you've aged.
Yeah. And so we started working together when Erin was just out of high school. So, Erin's whole working career, although we have done income generating things on the side as we've gone through our business transitions. And, I was a single mom raising my kids. I was a life skills coach, teaching workshops. So I've always been focused on helping people figure out what they want to do with their lives. And I think we're still doing that in the different capacity now.
Yeah. So what inspired you to start Trailblazer Co. and Trailblazer Magazine? Like you said, you were in a business before, Prairie Girl Outpost, where you were helping rural women, plan their businesses and be successful in their businesses. How did you pivot and go in this direction?
I'll go first. For me, it's kind of an aha moment that, looking back over the past year of how did we get to where we are? And I think, so we've always worked with women entrepreneurs, women who had a passion to do something bigger with their lives, have more meaning, use their natural skills and talents. And so we've always worked with women entrepreneurs in that capacity, like Jan mentioned earlier, websites and branding, consulting. But it's only in the last 6 or 7 years that we started incorporating the word trailblazer. And so to us, the word trailblazer became the epitome of who we wanted to be and who the type of woman that we wanted to work with. And so the last 6, 7 years, like Trailblazer, like we've developed business courses, we had Facebook groups, we developed a creative writing process. So everything kind of fell under this brand Trailblazer. And to be honest, we worked with it for 5 years or so, and we kind of got tired of the word, and what we were doing with it just wasn't working. It didn't feel right. So we took a break from it.
Yeah.
And then
trying to figure out,
well, what the heck do we do now?
How are we going to package? Because our business is based on a collaboration of our skills. And I mentioned writing and design, but we're also very forward looking and looking at what's going on in the world. And so Trailblazer Co., the whole brand, is about as powerful, I think, for women that we're working with as it is for us. And that, to me, the bottom line is wanting to take my knowledge, my ideas, my experience, and take it and see how far I can go, what we can create, how big could we get, which means how many women will we impact. And we want to bring every woman who's working with us and associating, collaborating along for that ride.
This week, you'll meet Megz Reynolds. Give us your background and how you got your start in agriculture.
Well, I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and my grandpa and my uncle had a ranch in southern Alberta near Pincher Creek. So growing up, I got to spend weekends and some summers out around the cattle side of agriculture. Definitely didn't know anything about the crop side of agriculture, though. And I had a 10-year career in the Canadian film industry before I met my ex-husband and traded film sets for tractor cabs and moved out to a grain farm in southwest Saskatchewan. Really, the only thing that I knew about grain farming at that point was that at some point, everything's going to break down. And that little bit of knowledge never failed me. So coming to the farm, I obviously wasn't going to be doing film out there and needed a job off farm. So I figured if I could apprentice as a heavy duty mechanic, that would be a great fit for also then being able to help on the farm and have a useful skill. So I started learning to work on equipment, working at a local AGCO dealership while I was learning to run all of the different pieces of equipment on the farm and learning how to grain farm and when we plant and what we're doing and why we do it and all of those things. And because of growing up in the city and then especially with film, I had a lot of misconceptions about how things are growing, the tools that farmers need to be successful, and a lot of fear surrounding food and some of those tech pieces. And so when I came to the farm and really dove into learning and understanding why things are important and changing my viewpoints on our food and how it's growing, I decided that I wanted to try to have a conversation with the person that I used to be. And that's when I started getting on social media. So I think that was about in 2014 is probably when I started trying to get on social media and talk about what we were doing on the farm, why we were doing it. Obviously, I've always had a bit of a fascination with equipment. And so got into making videos about what the equipment is, why we're using it, how it works, what's really cool about it. What are the things we're already doing to, reduce the products we're using, be more sustainable, et cetera.
What do you think were, like, going back to, 9 years ago, what were some of the initial conversations that you started to have with people online about, what you didn't know prior to becoming a farmer?
I really started with that GMO piece and that conversation because that was something I'd read all of these books and I really fed in that the anti-GMO movement has done such an incredible job of lobbying people to believe that things are scary when they're not and that we should fear them. And as humans, we make decisions using emotion and we're never going to get away from that. And so it's very easy to influence people through fear, influence parents, influence people who are caretakers of others, that you can't be 100% certain that you're not contributing to their illness or other things going on, and to feed that fear. And so that was really the piece that I wanted to start with, because coming to the farm and learning, it was like, no, this is incredible. Like, this technology is allowing farmers in drought-stricken areas to still be able to get a crop off. And it's allowing farmers to be able to reduce the herbicides and pesticides they need to use because they have a seed that's been developed to work with the good bugs in the field and in the soil and be detrimental to the bad insects, and just finding all of the amazing ideas. And I think trying to help fill that communication piece where agriculture just kept steaming along with all of these inventions and not communicating to consumers. And when I say consumer, that's all of us. It's not a us versus them. We're all consumers, and it's important for us all to understand and to trust. And the way we get to trust is through understanding.
Today, you'll meet Kate Schatt. Tell us how you got your start in agriculture.
So I grew up in a farming family that was no longer farming. My grandparents had got out of farming by the time I was born, but they still owned the property and the infrastructure. They had been primarily sheep farmers on a small island in west coast of Canada, where sheep thrive because it's really rocky and hilly, and sheep thrive, and there's lots of people that farm sheep there. So when I was I don't think I was even in my teens yet, when I started getting interested in raising livestock. And my parents are like, well, we live on a chunk of your grandparents' farm. We have a barn, we have fencing. Like, sure, why not? So we started with chickens, and then we got some sheep. We had a couple beef cows. We had a horse. I think we've had everything except for donkeys and llamas. I just was so fascinated by the idea of growing my own food. And my mom was a cheerleader, and my grandparents helped me out, coming up at 10 o'clock at night when a pig was giving birth, just were so there for us. And even though they weren't in it anymore, they had all the knowledge, and they all just encouraged me. And even when I failed, like if something died, because something always dies, they never made me feel like a failure, and they just were constantly cheerleading me.
That is such a neat experience for you. How do you start this goal? How do you start growing your own food and making it a sustainable thing for people who are listening, who are like, I think I would like to have a goal like this, but how do you go about doing that?
Trying to do it all at once, you'll burn yourself out, for sure. I would pick something you're already doing. Like, say you already have laying hens. Well, could you try meat birds? They're not an entirely different species. And could you try raising 50 meat birds? And now you have your year's worth of chicken, depending on your family size, right? You already grow a garden. Could you try growing a year's worth of broccoli for the freezer, right? Like, say broccoli grows well for you. What would it take to grow a year's worth? And the math my grandma always taught me is like, if we wanted to eat a quart of pears every week, well, then I need to can 50 quarts. So, say we're taking broccoli. We want to eat broccoli twice a week. Well, we need to grow, X amount of plants to make our goal. And just taking it that way and trying just one thing at a time, because whenever you try to scale up something, you're going to find new issues that you didn't have before when you raised small scale. And there's been some things that we try to raise large scale, like meat birds, and decide that we really, really don't like it and go back to raising just for ourselves.
This week, you'll meet Esther Vandenhoven. Tell us how you got your start in agriculture and how you became a rural woman.
Well, I did not grow up in agriculture. I grew up on an acreage in northern BC. We had horses at my insistence because I absolutely loved them, even though I was allergic to them, but pushed through and we got there. So I grew up with horses, and then I attended Olds College in Olds, Alberta, and to the equine program there. And then I went to continue my education, I guess, in England to Hartpury to get a bachelor's of science in equine management. And then when I was done that, I was looking at moving back home, and I did not want to go back to northern BC because it was very oil field up there, and I really wanted to stay closer to where I found home, which was in Olds, honestly. So I actually ended up moving to Airdrie. And then quite soon after that, I started dating my now husband in, 2013, we started dating. And he is a dairy farmer. Well, was a dairy farmer, I guess. His family had about, I think it was 50 head of dairy cattle when we first started dating. Then I spent all my weekends, I would drive up from Airdrie to Rimbey every weekend so that I could spend time on the farm. Just because I liked seeing all the animals and I liked the calves and I got to help feed the calves and I thought that was great. And then they sold the dairy a little while after we started dating. And when we moved in together, we moved into a house in town in Rimbey. And then we lived there together for a little while. And then one day we got a call from my now father-in-law that said some land had come up for sale close to where they farmed, where they still had a beef operation and a grain operation. So this land had come up for sale. It was another dairy farm that had sold out, and they had 3/4 of land and they didn't want to split the land. And there was a house and a yard on one of the pieces, and they had no use for a house at all. So we decided, he asked us if we wanted to move back onto a farm. So we did, because you take every opportunity to come back to the country. And then we lived here for 2 years. We kept our foot in farming with his parents a little bit. We rented some cropland so that we could pay for the farm, the part that we bought into, the house part. And then we had a few cows that were running with their herd. But it was looking like we had a whole yard. We had outbuildings and an old dairy barn that was sitting there doing nothing. And we didn't know what to do with it. We spent 2 years trying to think of everything we could just to use the empty buildings that were just sitting around. And it occurred to, I can't remember who, it was probably me, that we could get sheep. And we could lamb them out in the barn, and it would be wonderful. We could just, we already had the facility. I thought it would be so easy just to change it to a sheep facility from a cow facility. So we bought 50 head of sheep in 2017 and haven't looked back.
Tell us what that was like, making that big decision.
Yeah, so my husband works as an instrumentation tech in the oil field, doing mostly maintenance, which means that he is home at night most of the time, which is nice. And I sold insurance for the cooperators in Rimbey for 6 years, including my maternity leave. And then I was planning on, after our second child was born, I was planning on going back part-time, because we learned the hard way that not being home when we lamb causes losses that are intolerable. So I was always planning on being home doing lambing, but I thought that I would go back when we weren't lambing so that we would have some stable income. But it got to a point where we had just lambed in 2021. And I was looking at going back, and I was exhausted. I was trying to be mom to 2 little boys and run a farm and make sure we ate healthy and do all of these things. And something had to go. It was a breaking point that I had to admit to myself, I couldn't do everything. I had to choose something to go. And if it was the farm or working in town, I choose staying at the farm.
Today, you'll meet Natalie Green.
Well, my name is Natalie. New last name is Green. I got married to my awesome husband last year, and we live on 1 acre just outside of Richmond, Virginia, which we now call Green Acre since it's our last name, and we just have 1 acre of land. And we have chickens, pigs, occasional ducks, turkeys, quail. We had goats for a little while, and we also have rabbits. So we're doing a lot of things with our acre, as well as a large garden. And when I'm not here on the homestead, I am a middle school science teacher. So I've kind of combined my love for all things homestead and teaching, and started to educate the community when people are interested in learning how to do some of the things that we're doing, especially those that don't have a lot of space to do it in.
I want to circle back to your off-farm job, off-homestead job of being a teacher, because you shared with me a cool kind of initiative that your school is doing and how you're able to connect your agriculture background to your full-time job. So share with us about your project that you do with your students.
Yeah, so I teach middle school science, and I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So my main classes that I teach are life science and physical science. And then I teach a special advisory course, which is the class that students go to first thing in the morning. And it is a farm-based advisory. So our school years and years ago used to be a dairy farm. And I think about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a teacher there who was really interested in agriculture, and she helped the school bring back some of that land as a large garden and orchard space. So with the class that I have, I'm teaching them, what agriculture is, the different types of farming that people do. They're learning more about how to grow food and where their food comes from. And our school held a little festival this year that they helped plan, where they just talked about what the school had to offer as far as fresh fruits and vegetables and things. They actually set up a stand at the local farmers market over the summer. There's a farmer who works with the school and kind of handles that. So that's been really exciting. And we're actually working on making that class like a permanent course at the school so that more students can take it and be exposed to it. And hopefully I'm really working on convincing them to let me bring a few chickens to school too.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Karri Munn-Venn from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story.